among the many singular problems which came before my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes in the years of our long association in Baker Street, there were some which owed their fascination to the violence of the crime, and others to the eminence of the persons concerned. But there was a certain small class of cases whose peculiar terror lay in this, that a crime had been committed, and had been going forward for years beneath the very eyes of the world, and none had known that any crime was there at all. Of these, the affair of the Clerkenwell Clockmaker was, I think, the most remarkable, and I have hesitated long before setting it down, for it touches upon a sorrow so deep and so patiently borne that I have feared to do it justice. Yet Holmes himself was wont to say that of all the cases he had handled, this was the one in which mere observation had most nearly failed him, and human sympathy had most nearly saved him, and for that reason, if for no other, I think it ought to be recorded. It was a raw and yellow afternoon, in the November of 1889. A fog such as London alone can produce had settled upon the town since morning, not the clean white mist of the country, but a dense, greasy, saffron-colored vapor that pressed against the windows of our sitting-room and turned the gas lamps in the street below to dim and haloed smudges. The traffic of Baker Street came to us muffled and unreal, the clop of hooves and the cries of the cabmen sounding as though they reached us through wool. I had drawn my chair close to the fire, and was endeavoring with small success to interest myself in the columns of the Lancet, while Holmes, restless and out of humor, prowled from window to hearth and back again, glancing now and then into the murk without as a caged creature might glance at the bars of its cage. "There is no crime abroad in weather such as this, Watson," said he, flinging himself at length into his chair. "The criminal, like the honest man, keeps to his fireside when the fog is thick. He cannot see his victim, and, what troubles him more, his victim cannot see to give evidence against him. It is the dullest month of a dull year. I have half a mind to advertise my services in the agony column, that some enterprising scoundrel may be reminded of my existence." "You are surely not so idle as all that," said I. "Only this morning you were speaking of the monograph you meant to write upon the dating of documents by their inks." "Ink, Watson, is a poor substitute for blood," he answered, but he smiled a little as he said it, and I saw that his black mood was passing. "Still, you are right to reprove me. A man who cannot occupy his own mind has no business complaining that the world will not occupy it for him. Hark, is that the bell?" It was indeed the bell, and a moment later the boy in buttons brought up a card, which Holmes took and turned over in his long fingers. "Miscellaneous vein," he read, and beneath it, in a small, neat, upright hand, not the hand of the engraver but of the lady herself, added since the card was printed, upon a matter of the gravest urgency. There is character in that addition, Watson. A woman who prints her name yet feels the need to underline her own distress in ink, is a woman divided between propriety and desperation. "Show her up, boy." The lady who entered was perhaps 20 years of age, dressed in a plain gown of dark gray stuff, well worn but scrupulously neat, and a bonnet whose ribbons had been more than once retied. Her face, which had once been pretty and was still comely, was pale and pinched with some long anxiety, and there were shadows beneath her gray eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights. Yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity, and when she spoke it was in a low, controlled voice that betrayed her breeding despite the poverty of her dress. "Pray sit down, Miss Vane," said Holmes, with that gentleness he could always summon for a woman in trouble. "You are cold, draw nearer to the fire. My friend Dr. Watson may hear whatever you have to say. Indeed, his medical knowledge may prove of service. Now, tell me what has brought you across London through such a fog. You will think me foolish, Mr. Holmes, she began, folding her worn gloves in her lap. I have hesitated a fortnight before coming. I have told myself 100 times that it is nothing, that I imagine it, that grief has unsettled my mind. And yet I cannot rest, and I have no one else in the world to turn to. Begin at the beginning, said Holmes, leaning back with his eyes half closed, and tell it in your own way, omitting nothing, however trifling. My name, she said, is Eleanor Vane. Until 3 weeks ago, I was housekeeper and companion in the household of Mr. Josiah Crale, the clockmaker of Meredith Street in Clerkenwell. You may perhaps have heard the name, sir. Among those who care for such things, Mr. Crale was accounted one of the finest makers of fine clocks and complicated movements in London. Not a mere seller of clocks, but an artist who made great regulators and astronomical pieces for the observatories and for gentlemen of science. He was a widower, near 70 years of age, and for the last 9 years I have kept his house and tended him, for he had grown frail and there was no one else. 9 years, Holmes murmured. That is a long service, go on. 3 weeks ago, she continued, and here her voice trembled for the first time, Mr. Crale died. It was very sudden. He had seemed, if anything, better than his custom that week, brighter, more himself. And then one morning, I went to wake him and found that he had passed away in his sleep. The Dr. Selby, who had attended him for years, said it was the heart, that at his age it was to be expected that he had gone peacefully. There was no inquest. He was buried a week ago in the churchyard of St. James's, Clerkenwell. She paused and pressed her gloved hands together. And that, Mr. Holmes, ought to be the end of it. An old man full of years dies quietly in his bed. What is there in that to trouble anyone? And yet I am not easy. I have not been easy since the morning of his death, and I have come to lay before you the things that trouble me, and to ask whether I am a foolish woman or whether— She stopped. Whether, said Holmes quietly, your old master was murdered. She started, and the color left her face entirely. You have said the word I could not, she whispered. Yes. That is my fear. Holmes had opened his eyes now, and they rested upon her with that keen, bright attention which I knew so well. Miss Vane, a fear is not evidence, but it is very often the smoke by which we may trace the fire. You are plainly an intelligent and a self-possessed woman. You did not conceive this suspicion out of nothing. Tell me the particulars, the small things, the things that seemed wrong. Let me be the judge of whether they signify. The lady drew a long breath and seemed to gather herself. There are 3 things, sir, she said, and I will tell them in the order in which they came to trouble me. The first concerns the manner of his death. I said that Mr. Crale seemed brighter that last week. It was more than that. For years he had been sunk in a settled melancholy, a grief, I always thought, though he never spoke of its cause, and in that last week the cloud seemed to lift from him. He was almost gay. On the very evening before he died, he took my hand. He had never done such a thing in 9 years. And he said to me, Eleanor, I have been a coward for a long time, but I mean to set matters right at last. Tomorrow I shall do a thing I ought to have done 20 years ago. I asked him what he meant, but he only smiled and shook his head and said, "Tomorrow, my dear." And in the morning he was dead. "Tomorrow I shall do a thing I ought to have done 20 years ago," Holmes repeated slowly. "You are certain those were his words?" "They are burned into my memory, Mr. Holmes." "And the second thing?" "The second thing is stranger still, and harder to speak of, for it will make you think me mad." She hesitated. "For all the 9 years I served him, Mr. Crale kept one room in his house always locked, a small room upon the upper floor at the back next to his own bedchamber. He alone had the key. He carried it always upon his watch chain. He went into that room, I believe most nights late when he thought me asleep. I would hear the door and sometimes a faint sound within, though I never knew what he did there. He never spoke of it, and I never asked. It was not my place. I took it, God forgive me, for the harmless secret of a lonely old man, a hoard of money, perhaps, or old letters, or some private grief he wished to keep to himself. But on the morning he died, Mr. Holmes, the key was gone. Gone from the chain. Gone from his watch chain, which lay upon the table by his bed as it always did. Every other key was there, the key of the shop, of the house door, of the cabinets. But the key of that upper room was gone, and it has never been found. And the door of that room now stands unlocked, and the room is empty, swept bare, Mr. Holmes, as though it had never been used for anything at all. Holmes had grown very still. "You entered it, then, after his death?" "I did." "When the key could not be found, and after the funeral I forced the door myself, for I could not bear the mystery of it. And I found nothing. A small, empty room, with a table and a chair and a shelf, all bare, and the dust of the floor much disturbed, as though things had been dragged out of it in haste. Whatever my master kept there for 9 years and more, someone removed it, between the night of his death and the morning, or in the days that followed while the house was full of comings and goings. And whoever removed it took the key, so that none should know when the room was entered." "This is most interesting," said Holmes, and I could see that his languor had wholly departed. "And the third thing, Miss Vane?" "The third thing," she said, "is the reason I am no longer in the house, and it is the thing that has frightened me most of all. 2 days after the funeral, a gentleman came to the house, a Mr. Abel Crale, who announced himself as the dead man's nephew and heir. I had never seen him before, nor heard my master speak of any nephew in all my 9 years. He produced a will, drawn up, he said, some months since, leaving the whole of the property, the house, the business, everything, to himself. And his first act, Mr. Holmes, upon taking possession, was to dismiss me from the house that very day, with a month's wages and not an hour to find another situation. He was most anxious that I should be gone. He watched me pack my box. He would scarcely let me out of his sight. And as I left, he said a thing to me that I have not been able to forget. He said, "You have been a faithful servant, Miss Vane, and I am sure you are too wise a woman to trouble yourself with matters that are no longer any concern of yours. My uncle is at peace. Let him rest, and let the dead bury the dead." He smiled as he said it, sir, but his eyes did not smile. And I came away, and I have been turning it over in my mind ever since, and I could bear it no longer, and so I have come to you. There was a silence in the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the muffled rumble of a passing cart in the fog outside. Holmes sat with his fingertips pressed together, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling. Let us be clear upon the facts, he said at last. An old man, long melancholy, grows suddenly cheerful and speaks of righting an ancient wrong. That night he dies, of natural causes as the doctor certifies. A room he had kept locked for years, and visited nightly, is found emptied and its key vanished. And a nephew of whom no one had ever heard appears with a will, takes all, and is at pains to be rid of the one person who knew the household and to warn her against inquiry. Have I stated it justly? You have, sir, exactly. Then, Miss Vane, I will tell you plainly, you are not a foolish woman, and you have done entirely right to come. There may be an innocent explanation for each of these things taken singly. An old man may hide a key and lose it. A heir may be anxious and ungracious. A cheerful mood may precede a fatal seizure of the heart, for the heart is a treacherous organ, is it not, Watson? It is, said I. A sudden lifting of long depression is sometimes the herald of a fatal collapse, though it may equally mean nothing at all. Just so. Each thing alone is nothing. But three such things, falling together upon a single week, form a pattern which no prudent man may disregard. Miss Vane, I will look into this matter. Where are you now lodging? Her relief was so great that for a moment she could not speak, and I saw the tears stand in her eyes. I have taken a small room in Percy Street, off the Tottenham Court Road, she said. I have very little money, Mr. Holmes. I cannot promise you. We will not speak of that, said Holmes with a wave of his hand. The problem itself is my payment. It is a pretty one, and it has come to me on a day when I sorely needed it. Now, one or two questions before you go. This doctor, Selby, who certified the death, what manner of man is he? An elderly gentleman, Mr. Holmes, who had attended my master for many years. A kindly man, but old, and I think somewhat careless in his ways. He did not examine the body closely, that I saw. He came, he looked, he said it was the heart, and he wrote the certificate at the parlor table. And Mr. Crale's business, the clockmaking, who assisted him in it. A man of near 70 does not carry on so exacting a trade alone. There was a workman, sir, Mr. Daniel Frayne, a journeyman clockmaker who had worked for my master these 6 or 7 years, and was, I think, the only man living whom my master trusted in the matter of his finer work. A quiet, clever man of about 40. He is still at the shop. The nephew has kept him on, for without him the business could not continue a week. Excellent. And this last thing, Miss Vane, and then I will not detain you longer in such weather. You said your master had been sunk for years in a melancholy, whose cause you never knew. Had you never, in 9 years, any inkling of what that grief might be? A word let fall a name, an anniversary he kept. The smallest thing may serve. Miss Vane was silent a moment, thinking. There was one thing, she said slowly. Once a year, upon a certain day in the spring, the 4th of April, I think it was, my master would shut himself away and see no one, and I would hear him, through the wall, weeping in the night like a broken man. And once, only once, in the 9th year, I made bold to ask him gently whether I might do anything to comfort him upon that day. He looked at me with such a face of misery as I hope never to see again, and he said, "There is no comfort for a man who has let the innocent suffer for his own weakness, a leaner. Some debts cannot be paid, only carried." That is all he ever said. I never understood it. Who has let the innocent suffer for his own weakness, Holmes repeated, and he wrote the words upon his shirt cuff, as was sometimes his habit. "You have given me much to think upon, Miss Vane. Go home now and rest, and leave the matter in my hands. You may hear from me within a few days." When she had gone, Holmes sat long in silence, his pipe unlit between his teeth, his gaze lost in the fire. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he said at last. "It has an ugly look," said I. The nephew, appearing from nowhere with a will, dismissing the one witness, warning her off. It points very strongly to the nephew. "It points to him," said Holmes, "so strongly and so conveniently that I am inclined, on that ground alone, to reserve my judgment. When a case points at once, and without effort to a single obvious villain, Watson, I have learned to ask myself whether the obviousness may not itself be a part of the design. But you are right that he must be looked to. No, it is not the nephew who chiefly occupies my thoughts. It is the room. Consider the room, Watson. A man of frugal habits and settled melancholy keeps one chamber locked for years, and visits it nightly in secret. What does a man keep so? Money. A miser gloats over his gold, but he does not weep once a year over it, nor speak of innocents suffering for his weakness. No, Watson. Whatever was in that room was bound up with his grief, with his guilt, and with the wrong he meant too late to set right. Find what was in that room, and we shall be far on our way to the heart of this business. Reach me down the post office directory, there's a good fellow. And tomorrow, if this cursed fog will lift, we shall go to Clerkenwell and look upon the workshop of the late Josiah Crale. The fog did lift in the night, blown away by a wind from the east, and the next morning broke cold and clear, with a hard blue sky and a bright pitiless sun that showed London all its grime. We took a hansom eastward through the awakening streets, past Holborn and along the edge of the city, until we came to the close and ancient quarter of Clerkenwell, which was then, as it had been for 2 centuries, the very heart and home of the London clock and watch trade. In those narrow streets, behind 100 humble windows, worked the finishers and the springers, the dial makers and the engravers and the fusee cutters, each to his own small mystery of the craft. And the air of the place seemed to me to carry, even in the street, a faint sense of that patient, minute, unresting labor, as though the whole quarter were itself one great machine, ticking softly toward eternity. Meredith Street proved to be a short and respectable byway of sober brick houses, and the shop of Josiah Crale was marked by a modest window in which stood a single fine clock, a tall regulator of dark mahogany, its long pendulum swinging with a slow and stately beat, and above the door in faded gilt the words J. Crale Clockmaker, established 1841. A bell jangled as we entered, and we found ourselves in a low, dim shop lined with clocks of every description, all of them going, so that the air was filled with a soft, multitudinous ticking, a whispering as of many small hearts, and now and then, as some movement reached its hour, a sudden chiming and striking that made me start. A man came forward from the back to meet us, a spare, stooping man of perhaps 40, with a pale, intelligent face, thinning hair, and the slightly narrowed, peering eyes of one who has spent his life bent over fine work. His hands, I noticed, were long and delicate, the hands of a craftsman, and he wiped them upon his baize apron as he approached. This, I did not doubt, was Daniel Frayne, the journeyman. "Good morning, gentlemen," said he in a low and courteous voice. "How may I serve you? A repair or a purchase?" Holmes had assumed the manner of an enthusiastic collector. "Neither, sir, and yet perhaps both in time," said he affably. My name is Holmes. This is my friend, Dr. Watson. I am a student in an amateur way of fine horology, and I had the greatest admiration for the work of Mr. Josiah Crale, whose death I learned of only recently and with much regret. I had hoped, before it was too late, to see something of his workshop, and perhaps to acquire a piece of his making as a memorial of a great craftsman. I take it I have the honor of addressing Mr. Frayne, of whose skill Mr. Crale is said to have thought most highly. The man flushed with a modest pleasure, and I saw that Holmes had judged his approach well. "You are very good, sir." "Yes, I am Frayne. It is kind of you to speak so of the master." His voice caught for a moment. He was the finest workman I ever knew and the best of men to serve. There are not many left who understand what his work was. Most that come in now want a cheap German clock for their mantle. But you, sir, if you understand his work, he hesitated, then seemed to make up his mind. Would you care to see the workshop, Mr. Mr. Crale, the new master, is not here this morning, and I am sure he would raise no objection to a gentleman of taste. I marked the slight constraint with which he named the new master, and I saw that Holmes marked it too. Frayne led us through a door at the back into the workshop proper, a long, low, well-lit room with a wide bench running beneath the north window, littered with the tools and materials of the trade. Files, engravers, tiny drills, coils of brass and steel wire, jars of oil, half-finished movements pinned out upon boards, and everywhere the small bright wheels and springs and pinions of the clockmaker's art. Upon the bench in the place of honor stood a great and beautiful machine, perhaps 4 feet in height, its works exposed, a marvel of gleaming brass and steel and crystal. "That was the master's last great work," said Frayne, and there was reverence in his voice. "An astronomical regulator, ordered by a gentleman of the Royal Society. It shows the true and the mean time, the phases of the moon, the position of the planets. It wants but a fortnight's work to finish, and the master died before he could complete it. It falls to me now, and I doubt my own hand is fine enough." He touched the machine with his long fingers, tenderly, as a man might touch a sleeping child. Holmes bent over the great regulator with an admiration that was, I believe, wholly genuine, and for some minutes the two men spoke together of trains and escapements and compensation pendulums, in language that was to me largely unintelligible while I looked about the workshop. And it was thus, quite by chance, that my eye fell upon a thing that seemed to me curious, and which I mentioned to Holmes afterward, though at the time I attached no importance to it. Upon the wall above the bench hung a row of small framed photographs and old engravings, views of famous clocks, a portrait of some bewigged horologist of the last century, and at the end of the row, a small, faded photograph of a young man in the dress of some 20 years before, a fresh-faced youth of perhaps 20, with a frank and open countenance. Beneath it, in the old man's crabbed hand, was written a single word, Tom. The frame of this one picture, unlike the others, was clean and free of dust, as though it were often handled, and the glass, I fancied, bore the faint smear of a recent touch. Presently Holmes, straightening from his examination of the regulator, remarked in the most casual manner, "It is a melancholy thing to take up another man's unfinished work. Tell me, Mr. Frayne, you were long with Mr. Crale, I think. 7 years, was it not? 6 years and 8 months, sir. A close and trusting relation, I make no doubt, between two men who shared so exacting a craft. Did he never speak to you of his family, of his heir, this nephew who has come into the business?" A shadow crossed the pale face of the journeyman, and he glanced involuntarily toward the door. "No, sir," he said, lowering his voice. "Oh, that he never did. I will tell you frankly, Mr. Holmes, since you seem a gentleman to be trusted, that Mr. Abel Crale came as a great surprise to all of us. In all my years here, I never heard the master speak of a nephew, nor of any living kin at all. He was a solitary man. And now," he stopped, "and now—" Holmes prompted gently. "And now the nephew is master here, and I have no right to speak against him," said Frayne, with the caution of a man who has his bread to think of. "He pays my wages. But I will say this, sir, and no more. He cares nothing for the work, nothing. He looks at that regulator." He nodded toward the great machine. "The finest thing the master ever made, and he sees only what it will fetch when it is sold. He has spoken already of selling the goodwill and the stock, and giving up the making altogether, and dealing only in cheap imported goods, which is a quicker road to money. It would break the master's heart if the dead can grieve. But there I have said too much. It is no affair of mine." "You are attached to the old ways," said Holmes kindly, "and it does you credit. One last question, and I will trouble you no more. I understand there was a room in the house above, a small locked room upon the upper floor, which Mr. Crale kept private to himself. Being so much in his confidence, did you ever learn what he kept there, or why?" Frayne looked at him with sudden sharp surprise, and something like fear came into his eyes. "How do you know of that room?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Miss Vane, the housekeeper, spoke of it," said Holmes. "Ah, Miss Vane. Poor lady, they turned her out cruelly." Frayne was silent a moment. Then he said, slowly and very low, "I know that there was such a room. I know that the master went there of nights. I know that once only in all my years, I saw within it for a moment when he came out and did not at first perceive me upon the stair. And I will tell you what I saw, sir, though I have never told a soul, and though it has puzzled me from that day to this. I saw a clock." "The clock," said Holmes. "The clock, sir. One clock standing alone upon a table in an empty room, and the master gazing upon it as a man might gaze upon a grave. It was no fine clock, a plain, cheap, common little clock in a black case, such a clock as any laboring man might have upon his shelf, worth but a few shillings. And the master, who made the finest clocks in London, kept that mean little thing locked away and worshipped it in secret. I could make nothing of it, sir. I have thought of it 1,000 times. And now they tell me the room is empty, and the clock is gone, and I know no more than you." I saw Holmes's eyes gleam, but his voice, when he spoke, remained perfectly level. "A common clock in a black case," he said. "Can you recall anything more of its appearance, any mark, any peculiarity?" Frayne knitted his brows. "It was old, 20 years old at the least by the style of it. A cheap American clock of a kind that was sold by the thousand in the 50s and 60s. There was a paper label pasted within the case at the back, as those clocks often had, with the maker's name, but I could not read it from where I stood. And the hands, sir, the hands were stopped. I remember that. The clock was not going. It was stopped, and the master never wound it, for I never once heard it strike in all the nights he sat with it. A dead clock in a locked room, watched over by the greatest clockmaker of his day. He shook his head slowly. It was not natural, sir. But grief takes strange forms, and I loved the old man, and I asked no questions. We took our leave of Daniel Frayne shortly after, Holmes promising to return and to consider the purchase of one of the smaller pieces, and we walked away up Meredith Street in silence until we had turned the corner. Then Holmes stopped, and I saw that his face was grave and intent. "A stopped clock, Watson," said he. "A cheap, common, stopped clock, 20 years old, kept locked away and mourned over by a great craftsman for the better part of a decade, and destroyed or removed within hours of his death. And a grief that returned every year upon the 4th of April, bound up with an innocent who suffered for the old man's weakness. And a sudden resolution to right an old wrong, followed at once by a sudden death. Watson, I begin to see the shape of a very dark and a very sad affair. But I must have more. That clock is the key to everything, and the clock is gone. We must find what it was, and I think there is but one way. A stopped clock, Watson, is a clock that stopped at a particular hour, upon a particular day, and men keep such clocks and stop them so for one reason above all others." "You mean," said I, "that it marked a death?" "I mean that it very probably marked the hour of a death," said Holmes. "It is an old and a widespread custom, as you know, to stop the clock in the chamber where a death has occurred, at the very minute of the passing, as a mark of respect and of mourning. Such a clock becomes a sacred thing to those who loved the dead. If Josiah Crale kept such a clock, then somewhere, some 20 years ago, a death occurred which he mourned to the end of his days, and for which he held himself in some way guilty. Find that death, Watson, and we find the root of the matter. Come, we have work to do, and it lies not in Clerkenwell but in the record rooms and the newspaper files. The past, in this case, is the only witness that cannot be dismissed with a month's wages. The days that followed were, I confess, among the most tedious of all my association with Holmes, and yet I look back upon them now with a kind of wonder, for I saw in them the full measure of my friend's extraordinary patience and thoroughness when he was fairly upon a scent. For the better part of a week he labored, and set me to labor, among the dustiest and least romantic of materials. We haunted the reading room of the British Museum and the offices of the older newspapers. We searched the registers of deaths. We made inquiry, through channels Holmes commanded, into the records of the courts. And all the while we had scarcely more to go upon than a date in April, a name, Tom, written beneath a faded photograph, and a stopped clock that no longer existed. It was slow and disheartening work, and more than once, I confess, I doubted whether we should ever bring anything out of it. But Holmes never faltered. "The wrong that a man weeps over for 20 years, Watson," he said, "leaves a mark somewhere in the records of men, if only we have the patience to find it. A death that shamed him, an innocent who suffered, these are not private things. They come before coroners and magistrates. They are printed in the columns of the press. We have only to know where to look, and to look long enough." And in the end, his faith was justified. It was upon the 6th day of our search, in the yellowed file of a long-defunct local newspaper, that I came upon the paragraph which broke the case open, and I remember still the strange thrill with which I read it, and carried the great bound volume across to where Holmes sat at the long table, and laid it before him. The paragraph was dated the 9th of April, 1868, 21 years before, and it recorded the proceedings at the Central Criminal Court in the case of a young man named Thomas Ferris, aged 20, journeyman clockmaker, who had been tried and convicted of the murder of one Silas Hook, a pawnbroker and receiver of stolen goods of Clerkenwell, and sentenced to death. The report was brief and businesslike, in the manner of such things. It stated that the prisoner Ferris had been in the employ of the victim's neighbor, that on the night of the 3rd of April, the pawnbroker Hook had been found beaten to death in his shop, his cash box rifled. That suspicion had fallen upon Ferris, against whom it was shown that he had quarreled with the dead man over a debt, that he had been seen near the shop that night, and that a sum of money answering to that stolen had afterward been found concealed in his lodging. The young man had protested his innocence to the last with great vehemence, declaring that the money had been given him by another, and that he had been elsewhere at the hour of the crime. But he could not or would not name the person who, he said, could clear him, and the jury, after a short deliberation, had found him guilty. Sentence of death had been passed, and, the report concluded in a later paragraph from a subsequent issue, had been carried into effect upon the 27th of the same month. Holmes read the paragraph through twice in silence, and when he looked up his face wore an expression I had rarely seen upon it, a kind of stern and sorrowful gravity. "There it is, Watson," he said quietly. "There is the innocent who suffered for another man's weakness. Thomas Ferris, Tom, journeyman clockmaker, aged 20, hanged 21 years ago for a murder he protested to his last breath he did not commit, who said the stolen money had been given him by another, who could have named the man who could clear him but did not. And the clock in the locked room stopped, I do not doubt, at the hour of that young man's death upon the gallows, or at the hour of the murder for which he died. Josiah Crale kept that clock, and wept over it every 4th of April, the anniversary not of the hanging but of the crime, and called himself the man who had let the innocent suffer for his own weakness. Do you see it now, Watson? Do you see the whole terrible shape of it? You believe, said I slowly, that Crale himself was the murderer, that he committed the crime for which young Ferris was hanged. That or something very near it, said Holmes. Consider. Ferris was a journeyman clockmaker. Crale was a clockmaker established. The report tells us since 1841 in that very quarter of Clerkenwell. The two men followed the same trade in the same small district. It is all but certain they knew one another, and highly probable that the elder employed or had employed the younger, for the photograph of Tom hung upon Crale's own workshop wall to the end. The money that hanged Ferris was money he swore had been given him by another. The another who gave it him, and who let him hang rather than come forward. There, Watson, is Crale's weakness and Crale's guilt and the grief of 20 years. Whether Crale struck the fatal blow, or whether he was the true thief who let another take the whole blame, we cannot yet say. But this much is plain. Josiah Crale went to his own death believing himself the murderer of the young man whose picture he kept, and whose memory he mourned in a locked room over a stopped clock. And on the last night of his life he resolved, at long last, to confess it, and to right the wrong, to do a thing he ought to have done 20 years ago. And before he could do it, he died. Then the nephew, said Holmes, and his eyes narrowed. The nephew. Now we approach the living crime, Watson, which is our proper business. The dead crime is 21 years beyond our help. Let us reason it out. An old man resolves to confess a murder, and to make what reparation he can. What form would that reparation take? A confession, certainly, But Crale was a man of substance, with a house, a business, a life savings. A man in his position, meaning to right a wrong done to a young man now dead, might well seek out that young man's family, a mother, a brother, a sister, and leave them all he had. That would be the natural act of a conscience awakened at the last. And such an act, Watson, would disinherit whoever expected to come into the old man's money. The nephew who appeared from nowhere with a will made some months since, and who took all. Watson, I will wager a good deal that Josiah Crale had, until that last week, no thought of leaving his money to any nephew, and that the will which Abel Crale produced is either a forgery or a genuine will which its beneficiary had the strongest reason to see put into effect before the old man could revoke it. Crale meant to make a new will or a confession, or both, on the morning after the night he died. He died in the night. The room was emptied and the incriminating clock removed. And the sole person who profited by that timely death, and who has since labored to silence inquiry and to be rid of witnesses, is the nephew, Abel Crale. It is as pretty a case of murder to prevent a confession as ever I have met with. But, and here Holmes held up a warning finger, we have not one particle of proof, and a suspicion, however strong, is not a rope. We must have proof, and to get it, we must first know who this Abel Crale truly is, and how the old man died, and where the little black clock has gone. The clock, Watson, always the clock. He would not have destroyed it. A man who murders for an inheritance does not burn a worthless clock. He does not even trouble himself over it, unless he understands its significance. And if he understood its significance, then he understood the confession it represented, and that is itself the strongest evidence of his motive. Either way, that clock is the pivot. We must find it. That evening Holmes was much occupied with the sending and receiving of telegrams, and the next morning brought him, from a source among his acquaintance in the legal profession, the information he sought concerning the person of Abel Crale. It was illuminating enough. There was no record of any nephew of Josiah Crale by that or any other name. The clockmaker's only brother had died childless many years before. But there was a record in quite another connection of a man named Abel Crale. The name, Holmes observed, was very possibly assumed, or borrowed to fit the occasion, who was known to the police as an associate of forgers and a dealer in false paper, a plausible and dangerous man who had twice been suspected of preying upon the aged and the solitary, insinuating himself into their confidence and their wills, though nothing had ever been brought home to him. So, said Holmes, laying down the paper, our nephew is no nephew, but a professional wolf who fastens upon lonely old men. The question is how he came to fasten upon Josiah Crale, and whether he did so before or after he learned the old man's secret. But I begin to think, Watson, that we may be doing even this scoundrel a partial injustice, that the truth may be stranger and sadder than a mere fortune hunter's murder. There is a piece missing still, and I shall not be easy until I have it. I must see the body. The body. But the man is buried, Holmes, buried a fortnight since. Then he must be unburied, said Holmes calmly. If Josiah Crale was murdered to prevent a confession, then the manner of his murder is our surest evidence, and it lies in his grave. I shall see Lestrade this morning. An exhumation is a grave step, you will forgive the expression, and it requires the authority of the Home Office. But the facts we have gathered, laid before the proper persons, will, I think, suffice to obtain it. Doctor. Selby's careless certificate will not stand against them. Meanwhile, Watson, There is a task for you, and one for which your medical character fits you admirably. I wish you to call upon old Doctor Selby as one medical man upon another, making some pretext of a consultation, and to draw from him, without alarming him, exactly what he observed, or failed to observe, upon the morning he certified the death of Josiah Crale. An old and careless practitioner will often let fall to a colleague what he would conceal from a detective. Learn in particular whether he observed anything of the eyes, the skin, the lips, and whether there was any smell about the body or the room. You take my meaning. You suspect poison. I suspect nothing and consider everything, said Holmes. But an old man who is to die conveniently in his sleep, in a household where there is a professional poisoner of the aged, invites the question. Go, Watson, and be subtle. I did as Holmes directed and found Dr. Selby to be, as Miss Vane had described him, an elderly and kindly gentleman, but sadly failed in his powers, vague and comfortable and much given to reminiscence. Under cover of consulting him upon an imaginary case of my own, I brought the conversation round to the subject of sudden deaths in the aged, and thence to the late Mr. Crale, whom I profess to have known slightly. The old doctor spoke freely enough. He had attended Crale for years. The man had a weak and irregular heart. His death had been no surprise. He had found him lying peacefully in his bed, the features composed as though he had died in his sleep. Pressed gently, he admitted that he had made no close examination. For what need, my dear sir, in a case so plain? But he did recall, upon reflection, two small things which he had thought nothing of at the time. The first was that the dead man's pupils had been very greatly contracted, drawn down, as he put it, to mere pinpoints. The second was that there had lingered in the bedchamber a faint, sweetish, heavy odor, which he had taken for some cordial or medicine, and which the nephew, a most attentive and grieving relative, had explained as a draught the poor old gentleman had been in the habit of taking to procure sleep. I carried this intelligence back to Holmes in some excitement, for even to my mind its significance was plain. He heard me out and nodded slowly. The contracted pupils drawn to pinpoints, he said, and a sweetish, heavy odor in the room explained away as a sleeping draught. Watson, you have done admirably, and you know as well as I what those signs betoken. Of opium, said I, or one of its preparations. Laudanum, most likely. An overdose of laudanum, which contracts the pupils and leaves that very odor, and which, given to a sleeping man or to a man persuaded to take it as a composing draught, would kill him quietly in the night and leave scarcely a trace that a careless physician would remark. Precisely. And laudanum, tincture of opium, is the commonest thing in the world, to be had at any chemist's, an article in every household medicine chest. It is the poisoner's oldest friend, for a dose of it in a nightcap, in a glass of hot spirit and water such as an old man might take on a cold night, would pass unnoticed by taste, and the death that followed would wear every appearance of a peaceful passing in sleep. There is our means, Watson, and the exhumation, when it comes, will confirm it, for opium leaves its evidence in the body long after death, and a proper analysis will find it where poor old Selby's failing eyes did not. We have the means. We have the motive. We have the man. What we still want, and what alone will hang him, is the connection made fast and sure, and for that I return again, I still need the clock. The exhumation of the body of Josiah Crale was carried out some days later, under the authority of the Home Office and in the presence of Lestrade, who had by now been brought fully into the affair, and who, though he grumbled at the irregularity of Holmes's methods, could not deny the gravity of the facts. I will not linger upon the melancholy scene in the little churchyard of St. James's in the gray and dripping dawn, nor upon the analysis that followed, which was conducted by a Home Office toxicologist of the first rank. It is enough to say that the analysis established beyond any doubt the presence in the body of a very large quantity of opium, far more than any medicinal dose, and that the medical evidence was clear that Josiah Crale had died, not of his heart, but of poisoning by that drug, administered on the night of his death. The peaceful passing had been a murder after all, and Miss Vane's woman's instinct, which the world would have called a foolish fancy, was vindicated to the letter. "And now, Lestrade," said Holmes, when this grim confirmation was in our hands, "we may proceed to the arrest of Mr. Abel Crale. But I would ask you to indulge me in one particular. I have a strong desire to be present when he is taken, and to be permitted to put certain questions to him, and to search the premises myself before your men lay their hands upon anything. For I tell you frankly that though we can now prove the old man was poisoned, and can prove that this false nephew profits by his death and has lied about his very identity, a clever counsel might yet argue that the poisoning was the act of another, the housekeeper, say, whom we should be putting in the dock in his stead. To make all sure, I must lay my hand upon the one object that ties this man beyond escape to the knowledge of the old man's secret, and the motive for his silencing. I must find that clock." And so it was that upon a bleak and blustering afternoon, some 3 weeks after Miss Vane had first climbed our stair in the fog, Holmes and I, with Lestrade and 2 constables, presented ourselves once more at the shop in Meredith Street. The soft ticking of the many clocks greeted us as before, and Daniel Frayne looked up from his bench in alarm at the sight of the police. Holmes reassured him with a quiet word and bade him remain, and we passed through into the living quarters of the house, where we found Mr. Abel Crale. He was a large, smooth, florid man of perhaps 45, well dressed in a manner a shade too glossy for true gentility, with a round, agreeable face and quick, restless eyes that took us all in at a glance, and grew wary at the sight of the constables' uniforms. But he was master of himself, I will grant him that. He rose with an air of injured surprise, and demanded, in tones of ready indignation, the meaning of this intrusion. "The meaning, Mr. Crale," said Holmes, "is that we are here to inquire into the death of Josiah Crale, which we have reason to believe was not a natural one. For the briefest instant I saw the mask slip, saw a flash of something cold and calculating in the restless eyes, but he recovered at once and blustered admirably. Not natural. What monstrous suggestion is this? My poor uncle died in his bed of a weak heart, as his own doctor certified. Who dares to say otherwise? Is it that dismissed servant, that vain woman who has been spreading her spiteful tales? I warn you, gentlemen, I will have the law on any who slander. The body has been examined," said Holmes quietly, "and found to be full of opium. Your uncle was poisoned, Mr. Crale. That is not slander. It is the finding of the Home Office. And since you are not, as it happens, his nephew at all, Josiah Crale having had no nephew living, I fear you will have a good many questions to answer." The man's florid face went a shade paler, but he held his ground with the desperate coolness of the practiced rogue. "This is absurd. I have my uncle's will, drawn by his own hand and witnessed in due form. Whatever this fellow says of nephews, the will is plain and it names me. And as for poison, if the old man was poisoned, look to the servant, look to the workman, look to any who had the handling of his food and drink. I was but a visitor in this house. You have not one scrap of evidence to connect me with any such deed, and well you know it. It was, I could not but feel, a formidable defense, delivered with an assurance that shook even Lestrade. For indeed, as Holmes had foreseen, we could prove the murder, but the direct proof of the murderer's hand was still wanting. And it was then that Holmes played the card he had held so long in reserve. "You are quite right, Mr. Crale," said he, with a courtesy that was more menacing than any bluster. "The mere fact of the poisoning does not, of itself, name the poisoner. But there is more to this than a poisoning. Josiah Crale, on the last night of his life, meant to make a confession and to right a great wrong of 20 years ago, a wrong concerning a young man, wrongly hanged, and a certain clock that the old man kept in a locked room upstairs as the token of his guilt. Whoever killed him to prevent that confession and to secure his fortune before it could be given away in reparation. And that person, Mr. Crale, was a person who knew the secret of the locked room, who understood the meaning of the clock. For an ordinary thief would have left a worthless clock where it lay. Only one who knew that the clock was a confession waiting to be spoken would trouble to spirit it away. Find the man who took the clock, and you find the murderer. It is very simple. Then find your clock, sneered Abel Crale, and find your man. I know nothing of any clock. I mean to find it, said Holmes. And here, to the astonishment of us all, he turned his back upon the false nephew altogether and walked out of the room and back into the workshop, where Daniel Frayne stood white and trembling among his ticking clocks. And he went straight up to the wall above the bench, to the faded photograph of the young man labeled Tom, which I have already described, the one frame that was clean and free of dust and often handled, and he lifted it down and turned it in his hands. You knew him, did you not, Mr. Frayne? Said Holmes very gently. You knew Thomas Ferris? The journeyman gave a sort of gasp and put out a hand to steady himself against the bench, and his pale face crumpled like a child's. He was my brother, he whispered. God help me. He was my brother. I have witnessed many strange turns in the course of my friend's investigations, but I do not think anything ever took me more completely by surprise than this, and I saw that even Lestrade stood dumbfounded. Only Holmes seemed unmoved, though his eyes, resting upon the broken man before him, held a great compassion. I know he was your brother, said Holmes. I have known it or guessed it these several days. Ferris was your brother's name, and Frayne is your own. You changed it, I do not doubt, to escape the shadow of the gallows that hung over your family, and you came, as your brother had once been, into the trade of clockmaking, and at last into the very workshop of the man who bore the guilt of your brother's death. The question I must ask you now, Daniel Frayne, and I charge you to answer it truthfully, is this. What did you do when you learned the truth? The wretched man sank down upon the stool at his bench and buried his face in his hands, and for a time he could not speak. Then, in a low and broken voice, with the many clocks ticking softly all about him, he told us the whole of the strange and terrible story, and I set it down here as nearly as I can recall it, for it was the confession not of a common criminal but of a man wronged past bearing, and it moved us all. I was a boy of 12, he said, when they hanged my brother Tom. He was the best of brothers to me, There were but the two of us, our parents being dead, and he was as innocent of that murder as you are, sir. I knew it then, and I have known it all my life. He told me the last time they let me see him that he had not done it, that the money they found had been given him by a man he trusted to keep for him, and that that man could clear him with a word if he would only come forward. But that the man had not come forward, and that Tom would not name him, for, the journeyman's voice shook, for he had given his word, sir. My brother went to the gallows sooner than break his word to the very man who was letting him die. That was the kind of man Tom was. I never knew who that man was. Tom would not tell even me. Our name was blackened, and I was sent away to distant kin, and I grew up and learned the clock trade as Tom had done before me, and I changed my name and thought the past was buried. And then, some 7 years ago, being in want of a place, I came by chance to seek work with old Josiah Crale, the great clockmaker of Clerkenwell, of whom I had heard all my life as the master of the craft. And he took me on, and little by little, over the years, working at his side, trusted by him, loved by him almost as a son, for he had no son, and I think he came to love me. Little by little, gentlemen, I came to understand the truth. I saw the photograph of my own brother upon his wall, which he did not know I recognized. I heard him weep upon the 4th of April. And one night I saw within the locked room, and I saw the clock, the little black clock that had stood upon the shelf of the very shop where the murder was done, the pawnbroker's shop, the clock that stopped, they said at the trial at the hour of the murder at 17 minutes past 9 on the night of the 3rd of April. Old Crale had bought that clock, or taken it and kept it, and stopped it forever at that hour, and mourned before it every night for 20 years. And then I knew that Josiah Crale was the man Tom had shielded, the man whose word would have saved my brother and who had let him hang. There was a dreadful silence in the workshop. Abel Crale, in the doorway between two constables, had gone very still. I could have killed him, Frayne went on, in a voice grown strangely quiet. God forgive me, for months I thought of nothing else. To have served him, loved him, called him master, and all the while he was the murderer of my brother, twice over. Once by the blow that killed the pawnbroker, and once by the silence that killed Tom. I thought of poison, I thought of the knife, I lay awake and planned it. And then he lifted his ravaged face, and then, gentlemen, I could not do it. For I had come to love the old man. That is the horror of it, that is the thing I cannot make you understand. He was gentle to me and broken with his grief, and I saw that he suffered every day of his life a torment worse than any I could inflict, that he was already in a hell of his own making, and I found that I could not add to it. I resolved instead to do a thing that was, I think, crueler and yet kinder than murder. I resolved to make him confess. Not by force, by mercy. I began, little by little, to speak to him of forgiveness, of confession, of the peace that comes to a man who at last owns his sin and makes what amends he can. I never let him know that I knew. I spoke only as one might speak to any troubled soul. And it worked upon him, gentlemen. Slowly, over that last year, it worked upon him. And in that last week he came to me. He did not know I was Tom's brother, he never knew. He came to me and he said, Daniel, I have carried a great sin for 20 years, and I mean at last to lay it down. Tomorrow I shall go to a magistrate, and I shall confess a thing I did long ago, and I shall make what reparation I can to those I have wronged. Those were his words. And I who had schemed for a year to bring him to that hour, I wept, sir, for joy and for grief together, for I knew my brother's name would be cleared at last, though it could not bring him back. He stopped and covered his face again. And that night, said Holmes softly, he died. That night he died, said Frayne, and I swear to you before God that I had no hand in it. I had schemed to make him confess. I had never at the last meant him harm. When they told me in the morning that he was dead, dead the very night before he was to clear my brother's name, I thought my heart would break a second time. And then this man came. He raised his head and looked at Abel Crale with a loathing terrible to see. This man with his false will and his lies about being a nephew, this man who had been hanging about the old master these 2 months past, worming his way in, flattering him, and whom I had mistrusted from the first. And I understood. I understood that he had somehow learned what the old man meant to do. That Crale meant to make a new will and leave all in reparation, and that he had killed him in the night to prevent it, and to keep the fortune he had schemed for. He killed the old man on the one night when the old man's death also destroyed my brother's last chance of justice. And so I said nothing of what I knew, gentlemen, and I bided my time, and I watched, and I prayed that somehow the truth would come out. That is all. That is the whole of it. Do with me what you will. Holmes laid his hand upon the journeyman's shoulder. You took the clock, he said. After the old man's death, you took it from the room before this man could destroy it. I did, said Frayne. In the confusion of that first morning, before the nephew thought of it, I went up and I took the clock and the old man's own written confession that lay beside it. For he had written it out, sir, that last night, meaning to carry it to the magistrate in the morning. And I hid them away, for I knew they were my brother's vindication, and I feared this man would burn them. I have them still. I did not know what to do. I am no detective. I am only a clockmaker, and a poor one. I could not prove the old man was murdered. I feared that if I spoke, I should only be accused myself, being what I was and bearing the name I bore. So I held my peace and waited. And now you have come, and I thank God for it, whatever becomes of me. Fetch them, said Holmes. Frayne went to a locked drawer in his own bench, beneath the tools of his trade, and brought out, wrapped in a cloth, a small, cheap, black-cased clock. Its hand stopped forever at 17 minutes past 9, and with it a folded paper, closely written in the crabbed hand of an old man, and signed, and dated the very night of his death. When Holmes had read this document aloud, in the hush of that workshop full of ticking clocks, there was not one of us unmoved, not even Lestrade, who blew his nose loudly and looked away. And it was in that moment of silence that Abel Crale, seeing all lost, made his one desperate attempt, and flung himself toward the door. But the constables were too quick for him, and he was taken and held, snarling now and stripped at last of all his smooth assurance. The rest may be told briefly. The confession of Josiah Crale, together with the medical evidence of poisoning and the proof of Abel Crale's false identity and forged will, formed a chain that not even the ablest counsel could break. It was established at his trial that the man, whose true name was never certainly known, was indeed a professional preyer upon the aged, who had insinuated himself into the old clockmaker's confidence some 2 months before the death, posing as a long-lost relative and obtaining, by flattery and by fraud, a will in his own favor. He had learned, it was supposed, from some incautious word of the old man's, or by listening at doors, that Crale meant to confess an old crime and to give away his fortune in reparation. And, seeing his prize about to slip from him, he had procured laudanum and on that fatal night had given it to the old man in a glass of hot spirits and water, and so had murdered him to secure the inheritance. He was convicted upon the clearest evidence and paid the full penalty of the law, a fate which, by a grim justice, matched that which his victim's cowardice had once brought upon the innocent Thomas Ferris. As for Daniel Frayne, no charge was ever brought against him, for he had committed no crime. His long and secret campaign to bring the old man to confession was no offense known to the law, whatever it may have been in the sight of heaven, and his removal and concealment of the clock and the confession had served, in the end, only the cause of justice. The confession of Josiah Crale was laid before the proper authority, and after due inquiry the name of Thomas Ferris was cleared, 21 years too late, of the murder for which he had died. And I have always thought that this tardy vindication of his brother was, to Daniel Frayne, a fuller recompense than any that the law could have given him. He carried on the business of the shop for a time under the direction of the estate, and it was he, I am glad to record, who at last completed with his own hands the great astronomical regulator which his old master had left unfinished, so that the final work of Josiah Crale went out into the world made perfect by the brother of the man he had wronged. A strange and touching reconciliation across the grave, of which I have often thought since. And there was one further piece of justice, quieter than the rest but not, I think, the least. The will by which Abel Crale had sought to inherit was, of course, set aside as a forgery, and it was found that the old man had died intestate, save for that written confession, which expressed his desire that his whole estate should go to the family of Thomas Ferris in reparation. There being no surviving family but Daniel Frayne, and he declining, with a dignity that did him honor, to profit by the money of the man who had ruined his house, the matter was in some danger of a legal tangle. But it was resolved at length, upon Holmes's own suggestion, by a settlement of a modest annuity upon Miss Eleanor Vane, in recognition of her 9 years of faithful service and of the courage that had first set the whole inquiry afoot. She had come to us, it will be remembered, half fearing that she was a foolish woman troubling herself over nothing, and she went away vindicated, provided for, and at peace. It was some days after the conclusion of the affair that I sat with Holmes before our fire in Baker Street, the winter dark pressing at the windows, and put to him the question that had remained with me. "Holmes," said I, "you told me at the very outset that this was the case in which observation had most nearly failed you, and human sympathy had most nearly saved you. I have been turning that over, and I confess I do not wholly take your meaning. Your observation seems to me to have served you as well as ever it did. The stopped clock, the dusted photograph, the contracted pupils. Where did it come near to failing you?" Holmes was silent a moment, gazing into the fire. "It came near to failing me, Watson," he said, "in this, that every fact I observed pointed with a dreadful consistency toward Daniel Frayne. Consider his position, as it must appear to a mind that reasons from the facts alone. Here was a man who had concealed his true name and identity, who was the brother of a youth wrongly hanged for a crime the dead man had committed, who had, therefore, the strongest motive for revenge that the human heart can know, who had wormed his way into the very household of his enemy under a false name, who had access to the old man's food and drink, and who, upon the death, had secretly removed and hidden the one object that proved the old man's guilt. Watson, had I reasoned from observation alone, had I been the pure logician I have sometimes fancied myself, I should have arrested Daniel Frayne for the murder of Josiah Crale, and every fact in the case would have seemed to cry out for his conviction. The evidence against him was far stronger, upon its face, than the evidence against the true murderer. "Good heavens," said I had not seen it in that light. What was it, then, that saved you from so terrible an error? "It was the confession and the manner of the death taken together," said Holmes. "Read not with the cold eye of logic, but with some understanding of the human heart. Ask yourself, Watson, if Daniel Frayne had murdered the old man out of revenge, at what moment would he have done it? Surely not upon the very eve of the confession he had labored for a year to bring about. Not on the one night when the old man's death would forever silence the vindication of the brother he sought to avenge. To kill Crale that night was to destroy, with his own hand, the one thing Frayne desired above all else in the world, the clearing of his brother's name. No man murders to defeat his own dearest purpose. The very timing of the death, which pointed the finger of guilt at the man of motive, was in truth his complete exoneration. For the crime was committed at the one instant when it could profit only a man who wished the confession suppressed, and could injure most cruelly the man who wished it made. The murder was aimed, so to speak, in exactly the opposite direction from Frayne's whole desire. And once I had grasped that, once I had understood that the poisoning served the interest of concealment and destroyed the interest of revenge, I knew that the murderer must be, not the avenger who sought the truth, but the schemer who sought to bury it. Cold observation gave me Frayne. Sympathy, the effort to feel my way into the heart of a wronged man, gave me the true murderer. It is a lesson, Watson, that I shall not soon forget, that facts are mute, and that it is only when we understand what men love and what they fear that the facts begin at last to speak. He rose and knocked out his pipe against the grate. There is a great deal of human nature in this business, Watson, and not much of the science of detection that I am accustomed to pride myself upon. An old man who kept a clock stopped for 20 years at the hour of his sin. A brother who could plot a year for his revenge and then find, at the last, that love had unmanned him. A scoundrel who murdered to keep a fortune that a dying conscience meant to give away. It is a strange tangle of the best and the worst that is in us. And at the center of it all, that little cheap clock, stopped forever at 17 minutes past 9. The clockmaker's hidden victim, you might call it, for it was that silent, worthless thing, and not any living witness, that in the end spoke loudest for the dead and cried out the truth that men had buried for 21 years. He was silent a moment, then added more lightly, "Pray hand me the violin, Watson. I have had my fill of clocks and confessions, and I feel the need of something that keeps no time at all."